of the steam drifter Lydia Eva after years of dereliction following naval use for towing targets. This was an important event as the boat was the sole survivor of the great pre-war East Anglian herring fleet. Since her return, restoration has been carried out, first by the Maritime Trust and more recently by the Lydia Eva Trust itself. The vessel now serves as a floating reminder of a once great industry and stands as a tribute to the efforts of dedicated and enthusiastic local people determined to preserve part of the region's history. Here we see the Lydia leading the tall ships race out of Yarmouth in August 1978 on her way down to St Catherine's Dock, London. In the heyday of the herring industry before the First World War, about 1,000 boats worked out of Great Yarmouth and another 700 or so out of Lowestoft.
Now up jumps the herring, the king of the sea. Says he to the skipper, "You'll never catch me in this windy old weather, boys. Stormy old weather, boys. When the wind blows, we'll all pull together."
The huge fleets of herring drifters earlier this century consisted of both local vessels and Scottish ones, with the latter outnumbering the East Anglian craft. The season largely occupied the months of October and November and was known as the home fishing. The Scottish connection with Yarmouth and Lowestoft went back a long way to the 1860s and 70s, with ever-increasing numbers of craft coming down for the autumn voyage, especially from the Murray Firth area, ports such as Banff and Buckie, and also from the east coast, Fraserburgh and Peterhead. Yarmouth was the world's premier herring port, and places like Hall Quay, seen here, were the centre of great activity. About 30 miles northeast of Yarmouth and Lowestoft was Smith's Knoll, the most productive of all the herring grounds, but other of the North Sea sandbanks and shoals also yielded vast quantities of fish. There was keen competition to get out to the grounds first, ahead of the opposition, and each skipper always kept his fishing secrets closely guarded. Each boat shot something like 1.5 miles of nets, and hauling could take as much as 6 to 8 hours, or even longer, depending on the weather conditions and the quantity of fish caught. Here we see a good shimmer coming in over the side, but hard work for the men involved. The North Sea could be an unfriendly environment at times, and great skill was required on the part of the skipper and the mate particularly to ensure a boat's safety. Unfortunately, disasters did occur from time to time, such as the wreck of the Olive Branch, lost during the 1930s with all hands, 10 men drowned in pursuit of making a precarious and dangerous living. At other times, a vessel might simply be grounded or beached, and with any luck could be floated off at high tide. The sea was often a cruel mistress, and the return trip to harbour therefore always welcome to those on board. This piece of early film, dating from 1902, shows both steam vessels and Scottish sailing drifters in passage. The latter craft were of two varieties, Fifes and Zulus, but in East Anglian parlance they were always referred to as runties. The Scottish connection is seen here carried further, as 3 of the legendary fisher girls walk along Yarmouth Quay, knitting from the belt. Landing herrings at one time entailed counting them out into long hundreds. 2 fish in each hand made a warp, and there were 33 warps to the long hundred, 132 fish. This time-consuming practice was done away with in 1908 with the adoption of the Cran measure, 28 stones of fish by weight. A scene on one of the many pickling plots in the days before World War I, with Scotch girls carrying salted herrings and putting them into barrels for export abroad, especially to Germany, Poland and Russia. The technique of removing the gill and long gut before packing fish into casks was developed in the late 14th or early 15th century by a Flemish man called Willem Boykels. During the 19th century, the Scots refined the process further, resulting in the name of Scotch cure. It was a highly skilled operation, but hard on the women, who worked outside in all weathers, gutting fish at a rate of about 1 a second, their hands and arms constantly exposed to the ravages of the salt, which was sprinkled onto the fish in the gutting troughs, or farlins as they were known. There were many ancillary trades contributing to the fishing industry as a whole in both Yarmouth and Lowestoft. Here, shipwrights are seen adzing the ribs of a wooden drifter. Most of the oak used was produced locally, and the building methods had been passed down over hundreds of years. Fishing permeated all levels of community life. A children's sports day on Lowestoft's Crown Meadow in 1921 has the obstacle race using spars, nets and wooden casks, all of it equipment borrowed from the dominant industry. Parents, relatives and friends look happily on, but many of the fathers would have been absent at this time of year on the summer herring voyage to the Shetland Isles. Here we see a Scottish stream drifter from the port of Banff on its way out to the fishing grounds. And another vessel makes its way out through the Lowestoft pierheads. Boats could leave harbour at any time of day depending on where they were going, but on the outward journey there was always work to be done. On reaching the grounds, the skipper would pick his spot, preferably where the water was thick or puddly, indicating the presence of herring, and he would give the order to shoot. The nets were thrown over the side of the boat in a highly skilled operation, where every man knew what he had to do. As the first net was cast, it was traditional to say, "Over in the name of the Lord," or some such phrase, a supposed reference to the miraculous draught of fishes in St. John's Gospel. Herring nets had a working length of 33 yards and were about 12 yards deep. Each boat shot about 80 or 90 of them, perhaps more, but it was always an odd number, never an even one, 83 or 91, say. The nets were buoyed up on large canvas floats known as buffs, and were kept down in the water at the other end by a continuous length of rope, thick as a man's wrist, known as the warp. Once they were all over the side, the boat stopped its engine and drifted along on the tide, hanging to the nets, hence the term, drifting. Shooting a fleet of nets could usually be done in about half an hour, but hauling was a different matter. The crew might be at work as long as 8 or 9 hours with a good catch, or even longer if the weather was bad. Work commenced when the skipper judged the time was right, usually after 1 or 2 look-ons at the stem-end net nearest the boat. Herrings usually rose from the seabed at around dusk to swim in the upper levels, which is when they became enmeshed, but daytime swims also occurred. The act of shaking the fish from the meshes was known as scudding. The nets were made of cotton twine and were very hard on the hands. The warp was wound in by a steam capstan, many of which were made in Beccles by the firm of Elliott and Garud. Periodically, every quarter fleet of nets or so, the men hauling changed position so as to relieve each other. The hardest work was in the middle, where the greatest weight of fish usually was. The fish were shaken into a deck pound between the rail and the hold, known as the kid, while the men themselves stood on perk boards fixed in the hold. Once hauling was over, the fish were moved down through manholes in the deck to storage compartments in the hold. Wooden roaring shovels were always used for this. Once the catch was safely stowed, it was all speed for the home port, but even though hauling was over, work still had to be done, such as cleaning nets and taking out any fish not removed during scudding. Here we see the entrance to Lowestoft Harbour, one of the most difficult anywhere in Britain, especially in a southeasterly wind on an ebb tide. The boats were constantly on the move, both Scottish and local craft alike, with a good view provided here of the Lowestoft vessel Victor and Mary. Here we see the entrance to Yarmouth Harbour, taken from the Galston side, with various craft coming in from the fishing grounds and making for the quayside. All the crew members, hopeful of course for a good price at market, but with no guarantee of success. Lowestoft again now, with a tight turn being made round the dump end into Waveney Dock. Lowestoft was much more restricted for landing space than Yarmouth, and boats had to land their catches stem on. The herrings were lifted from the hold in quarter-crown baskets and swung ashore by a pulley wheel on the steam capstan. Each basket held 7 stones of fish, and the buyers liked to have them well topped up. A good view here down the hold of the boat, with a crew member scutching the herring into a quarter-crown basket. The fish are then shot into wooden kits and salt sprinkled on, prior to them being taken off to the pickling plots for gutting and packing. Landing was much easier at Yarmouth because of the huge amount of quay space on each side of the river. The boats were able to discharge their catches broadside on. Once landed, the fish were put into large double-compartment wicker baskets known as swills, which were to be found in Yarmouth only. As seen here on one of the many pickling plots, Scotch girls were at work gutting herrings and sorting them into a number of sizes for export. No matter how old they were, the women were always referred to as girls. They worked in teams of 3, 2 to gut and 1 to pack, and before the First World War they received a piecework rate of 8p a barrel, 3.5p or so in today's money. The fish were packed in salt, sardine fashion, in spruce wood casks, with one layer at right angles to another, and the quality of the product was very high. All the work was supervised by foreman coopers, who ensured that a high standard was maintained. A good view here of the far lanes at Lowestoft, with herrings being gutted. The small containers visible held the guts and other waste, which was collected and sold for processing into fish meal and manure. The selection of herrings into different sizes was done with great accuracy, a tribute to the skill of these hardy women from north of the border. Another method of preparing herrings for export was klondiking. This consisted of packing the fish in salt and ice in wooden boxes for transshipment to Altona in Germany. This trade was particularly important in Lowestoft, whereas Yarmouth was largely devoted to Scotch cure. In fact, klondiking actually began in Lowestoft during the 1890s, at the same time as the gold rush on the Klondike River in the Yukon. It produced a lot of money for those involved, hence the reference. Huge numbers of Klondike boxes had to be made each year, and one of the biggest fires in Lowestoft occurred before World War II, when thousands of them were set alight round about the time of the Guy Fawkes celebrations. Klondike herrings were always conveyed to Germany in German vessels, either converted trawlers or larger freighting craft. Here we see a German freighter, the Heinrich Grammersdorf, coming into Lowestoft to pick up a cargo of Klondikes. Not all herring was exported, of course. Some was kept for use in the United Kingdom. Kippering, for instance, was an important process, whereby the fish was steeped in brine, then split along the backbone and opened up, before being hung to cure over slow-burning fires of oak dust in the smokehouse. It was a method of cure first practiced at Seahouses, Northumberland, in 1843 by a man called John Woodger, and its success caused it to spread all over Britain. Other local varieties of cured herring included bloaters, which were originally developed in Yarmouth, and red herrings. In both cases, the fish was salted and smoked with the guts left in, but the red was a much harder cure and would last for weeks or even months before being used. Canned herring was another of the local East Anglian products. This is the Co-op factory in Lowestoft round about 1930. Female workers cleaned and prepared the fish, ready for processing, and any hard and soft roes were also put into tins. The oval cans moved along a conveyor line, an example of automation that was very modern at the time. Eventually the lids were put on and the cans sealed prior to the cooking process. Each lid had to be perforated to prevent explosions inside the oven, and after cooking was complete, each little exhaust hole had to be sealed with solder to make the can airtight. The ovens or retorts used for cooking were steam ones, and here we see them being loaded with cans of herring. Finally, the labelling. Jenny brand, a product held in esteem both far and wide. No surprise then, given all the different ways of processing herrings, that the drifters were constantly on the go, satisfying the demand for fish. Once a catch had been landed, it was off to sea again, pausing only to take essential stores on board, such as the bags of salt, seen being loaded here onto a Yarmouth vessel. Between the beginning of October and early December, the work hardly stopped, the only pause of any kind coming on a Sunday when the markets closed and the Scottish fleet laid in. There was no observance of the Sabbath for East Anglian vessels, however, and they went to sea, hoping to get good prices on the Monday. After the Second World War, herring fishing was a greatly reduced operation. The Scottish fleet of the 1950s was a shadow of its former self. Various changes had taken place, and the vessels seen moored here at Hall Quay, Yarmouth, were largely powered by diesel engines instead of steam. Here we see motor drifters heading out to sea down the river at Yarmouth, with the tower of Galston Parish Church plainly visible in the background. Every so often, steam drifters are discernible among them, reminding us of the heyday of the herring in years gone by. This steel boat from Peterhead, for instance, with her wonderful upsweep or sheer towards the bow, her lovely low lines amidships, and the prominent counter stern meant to ride a following sea. A classic indeed. Down the river they go, old boats and new, following the same route as their forebears, all the way back to the days of sail. Fraserburgh and Peterhead, communities like so many others whose fortunes were founded on the herring. Out of the harbour entrance at Yarmouth and across the bar, still participating in the age-long search for the silver darlings, but no longer the sheer number of boats which had once steamed out, with a fleet numbered at about 100 instead of 1,000. Changes are apparent too among the fisher girls, with a high overall average age, and no youngsters among them to carry on the tradition of gutting and packing, simply because the industry was in decline. In earlier times, many herring girls settled in Yarmouth and Lowestoft, having married local men, and seaside landladies were able to extend the summer holiday season by taking in Scottish visitors and giving them board and lodging. The girls were not always popular, however, because of the herring oil and scales on their working clothes, and it was often the custom to pin up oilcloth or brown paper on the walls of their rooms to help preserve the decor. A view here of the Yarmouth Fish Quay, much quieter than it had been 20 or 30 years before, and little activity in the river itself compared with the port's heyday. The fish just weren't there in such quantity any longer, and the once great industry was coming to an end. There have been other changes too since these pictures were taken, and the old wooden pier at Galston, with its picturesque lookout, has long been replaced by construction made of concrete. Even in the days of decline, however, the old practices were still in operation. Here we see a sample of a boat's catch being handed ashore prior to auction on the quayside. The fish salesman, book in hand, stands ready to take bids, but there are probably as many casual bystanders among the company assembled as there are actual buyers or merchants. Other survivals from pre-war days included the quarter-crown basket, seen here running the herrings ashore, and the wicker swills, Yarmouth's own indigenous container, for the making of which a specialist apprenticeship was often served. As unloading is carried out, other crew members busy themselves with necessary maintenance work, such as the mending of nets. At one time, great use had been made of horses and carts to move the catches from the quayside to the pickling plots and smokehouses, but towards the end of the fishing it was always done by lorry. The Scotch girls themselves remained a source of great interest and attraction to both local people and visitors, and though getting on in years, they had lost none of their skill at gutting herrings. The selection of fish into different sizes remained the same, as did the method of packing them into softwood barrels. The size of the operation was greatly reduced in scale compared with what it had once been. Freighters from overseas still came into port to take the pickled herrings away. And barrels of full herrings, that is, fish containing hard and soft roe, can be seen here going aboard a Russian vessel for transshipment to the Soviet Union. Another foreign craft in passage here, being towed down the river on its outward journey by the Yarmouth port tug, Richard Lee Barber. This film of the 1950s, taken by a Galston tobacconist, Bernard Botham, was shot only a decade or so before the industry finally collapsed in the early 60s. Lowestoft hung on a year or two longer, but when it too succumbed, the sight of the ubiquitous scavenging boy with herrings on a string became only a memory. The North Sea was largely fished out, and there were few herrings left to be caught and eaten. As one industry died in Yarmouth, another rose to take its place, the production of gas and oil in the North Sea, thereby helping to offset the unemployment caused by fishing's collapse. And old buildings found new uses. Lowestoft continued fishing, though with its effort almost exclusively concentrated on trawling for whitefish. And the old net drying posts on the North Denes were used for a different kind of gear. The past, however, is still kept alive in the local Maritime Museum, where a wonderful collection of artefacts and relics from the past can be viewed. Among them is the masthead vane for the Prunia Trophy, a prize awarded after the war each year by the famous London Fish Restaurant to the boat which caught the largest shot of herrings in a single night on the home fishing. Also to be seen is the trophy itself, a hand grasping a herring, carved in Purbeck marble. A museum of a different kind is the Raglan Street Smokehouse, in the sense that it still cures fish using traditional methods. Most of the herrings these days come from either Scotland or Norway, but during the autumn season, local longshores can still be purchased. The kippers, bloaters and red herrings produced here are first class, a tribute to the skills of Gordon Buckingham as he plies his time-honoured trade. Another tangible link with the past is the Lydia Eva herself, seen here moored at Hall Quay, Yarmouth. She was built in 1930 at King's Lynn and bought by Harry Eastick, a Galston vessel owner, who named the boat after his daughter. Mrs. Lydia Cox, as she now is, explains.
Well, at the time, when my father asked me, I really hadn't got any idea about it. And I didn't like the idea of him having it named after me. And he said he'd got it named after me because my brothers had all their sisters were named after. And he says, not what you want, it's what I want. And of course I didn't have anything else to say after that. And it was named after me, but I didn't give it a thought.
Naming boats after family members was an old tradition, but Jimmy May remembers the Lydia for a different reason, having actually worked on board her.
I was fireman in 1937. Yeah. You know, only for 2 or 3 trips, that's all. Because I filled in for some bloke who was ill. There were 10 on board. There was a skipper, the mate, the oarsman, 3/4 and 1/2 quarters, two 3/4 and 1/2 quarters, the cook, the chief engineer, the fireman. No, I used to fire, that's what I used to do. You know, of course, apart from when we was fishing, I used to go out help on the deck, you know, hauling, which was your job. When we got back, we had to get the fish ashore after they'd been sold. And, you know, the different crews had different jobs. You had 2 men down the hold, the fireman on the winch, even them out. You had 2 men, one on one line here, another one pulling the fish ashore. That all depends what boys bought them. Perhaps if they bought them to box them, or you just shoot them into boxes, but otherwise they'd go into swills. Well, they used to go to the gutting girls, and they used to gut them. They used to be singing, and they used to be gutting. They used to be singing songs, all sorts of it. But that was hard graft, them girls. All weathers, they were working in. How terrible. But like us, we're out in all weathers, won't we?
A hard life indeed, often with scant reward for those involved. Scenes like these have gone forever. The pickling plots at Yarmouth are now silent, though the memorial column raised by the town in 1815 to honour Horatio Nelson still makes an impact on the skyline. Of all the fish that swim the sea, the herring is the king, an old local saying which is perhaps confirmed by this little cartoon film made in the industry's heyday.